Normandy, June 1944. The air tastes like diesel and wet earth. A Sherman tank sits motionless in the shadow of a hedgerow, its engine idling to a whisper. Inside, 5 men breathe in shallow gulps, their bodies pressed against steel that's both shield and tomb. Beyond the ancient wall of tangled roots and bramble, something moves, the deep, predatory rumble of German armor searching for prey. The crew knows that sound. It's the growl of a panther, perhaps a tiger. Either one could punch through their Sherman's armor like paper. The Americans call their tank the Ronson, light's first time, every time, a grim joke that stopped being funny. Private Jack Donnelly, the loader, fumbles with a shell. His hands are shaking. They've been shaking since they landed on Omaha Beach 3 weeks ago. The cramped turret smells of sweat, gunpowder residue, and fear. His crewmates have learned to tolerate his nervous energy, his clumsy movements in the dark. They call him lucky, ironic, given how often he drops things. The German tank's engine roars closer. The commander's voice cuts through the tension, load AP. Now. Lucky reaches for an armor-piercing round in the dim light. Metal scrapes metal. The tank lurches over uneven ground. He loses his balance, grabs the wrong shell, high explosive instead of armor-piercing, and as he tries to correct himself, his boot catches on a spent casing. He stumbles. The shell jams. In a panic, he slams it home the wrong way. The gunner sees the Panther's silhouette emerge through the hedgerow. No time. No time for anything but instinct. The German cannon flashes white. The Sherman's gun fires half a heartbeat before impact. What happens next defies every principle of physics, ballistics, and fortune that these men have come to understand about war. The shell arcs through the air, wrong, backwards, impossible, ricochets off an ancient stone wall at an angle no one could have calculated, and pierces the Panther's thin side armor precisely where the turret meets the hull. The German tank shudders, smoke pouring from its hatches. In the sudden, ringing silence that follows, 5 American tankers stare at each other with the wide-eyed confusion of men who've just witnessed a miracle they don't believe in. This is that story. To understand what made that moment so impossible, you first have to understand the machine itself, the M4 Sherman, America's answer to mechanized warfare. It was a tank built not for elegance, but for abundance. Simple enough that a factory worker in Detroit could assemble it, reliable enough that it could cross an ocean and still fight, and cheap enough that the United States could produce 50,000 of them before the war's end. But quantity came at a cost. The Sherman's armor was thinner than its German counterparts. Its 75mm gun, while adequate against earlier Panzer models, struggled against the tigers and panthers that prowled the hedgerows of France. American tankers knew the grim mathematics. It took 5 Shermans to reliably knock out 1 Panther. The for that died buying that victory weren't mentioned in the equation. Yet the Sherman had virtues that statistics couldn't capture. It was fast, faster than any German heavy tank. Its engine was reliable, its suspension smooth enough to fire on the move. And perhaps most importantly, when 1 Sherman burned, 4 more were already crossing the Atlantic to replace it. The tank wasn't designed to be invincible. It was designed to overwhelm. But inside that metal shell, none of that industrial philosophy mattered. What mattered was the 5 men who transformed the machine from cold steel into something alive. The commander, perched in the turret with his head exposed to enemy fire, made decisions that kept them breathing or got them killed. The gunner, eye pressed to his sight, translated chaos into crosshairs. The driver and bow gunner, sealed in the hull, navigated by instinct through smoke and terror, trusting voices they could barely hear over the engine's roar. And the loader was the heartbeat of the beast, the rhythm that kept the gun fed and the crew fighting. These 5 men shared a space barely bigger than a walk-in closet. They ate together, slept beside their tank, and knew each other's fears by the smell of their sweat. In combat, they moved as one organism, a creature of flesh grafted onto steel, thinking in fractions of seconds, surviving on reflex and trust. The Sherman wasn't just a tank. It was a crucible that melted individuals into something more, something that could stare down death with a loaded gun and a prayer. The men who climbed inside knew they were driving a coffin that could move 40 miles per hour. but they also knew that the 4 men beside them would do anything, to keep that coffin from closing. For Lucky Donnelly and his crew, that bond would soon be tested in ways none of them could imagine. Jack Donnelly never planned on becoming a tanker. He'd grown up on a farm in Iowa, where the closest thing to combat was wrestling a stubborn tractor into submission. His hands were strong from years of hauling hay bales, but they'd never been what you'd call steady. His father used to joke that Jack could trip over his own shadow. The Army had other plans for him. After basic training, they assigned him to armored units, not because he showed any particular aptitude, but because the Sherman's appetite for replacement crews was insatiable. The Hedgerows of Normandy were chewing through tank battalions like a threshing machine. The loader's job seemed simple in training films: grab shell, load shell, repeat. But inside a Sherman under fire, simple became impossible. The turret basket was a maze of ammunition racks, spent casings rolling underfoot, and equipment that could take your head off if the tank hit a bump while you were standing. Every shell weighed over 20 pounds. The armor-piercing rounds were longer, the high-explosive ones stubbier. In good light, they were easy to tell apart. In the strobing chaos of combat, with smoke filling the turret and the gun recoiling inches from your face, muscle memory was all you had. Lucky's muscle memory was unreliable. He'd mixed up rounds twice in training, earning himself extra duty and the nickname that would stick with him through the war. His crew learned to double-check his work, to shout the shell type twice before he loaded. They ribbed him constantly, gentle at first, then with a dark humor that soldiers used to cope with the fact that a single mistake could immolate them all. But they also protected him. When he fumbled, they covered. When his hands shook before a mission, the gunner would talk about his sister's letters or the bar they'd visit in Paris when this was over. The commander made sure Lucky ate, slept, got the easiest maintenance duties. Not out of pity, but because crew chemistry was survival. A loader who doubted himself got people killed. A loader who knew his brothers had his back might just keep his head clear enough to do the job. Lucky wrote home every week, never mentioning the nightmares or the way his hands trembled when they weren't wrapped around a shell. He told his parents about the French countryside, about the food, about his crewmates. He told them he was fine. He was lying. The Norman bocage, ancient hedgerows that crisscrossed the countryside, transformed the battlefield into something out of a medieval siege. These weren't the decorative hedges of an English garden. They were walls of earth and root, 10 feet high and just as thick, built up over centuries by French farmers dividing their fields. Centuries of growth had turned them into natural fortifications. For the Sherman crews, every field became a separate battle. Every gap in the hedgerows was a potential kill zone. The tanks that were designed to race across open plains and overwhelm the enemy with mobility found themselves crawling through a claustrophobic maze where visibility was measured in yards and death could be waiting around every corner. The Germans understood the bocage's viciousness immediately. They positioned their tanks in carefully chosen spots, their guns zeroed on the few gaps where American armor had to pass. A Panther could sit in perfect concealment, engine silent, waiting for the telltale rumble of Sherman treads. The first shot advantage in this terrain was everything. The Americans were learning that lesson in burning steel. Lucky's platoon had lost 2 tanks in as many days. Men he'd shared coffee with that morning were gone by afternoon, some pulled from burning hulls with clothing fused to skin, others never making it out at all. The crew compartment of a Sherman hit by an 88mm shell became an incinerator within seconds. The survivors stopped talking about those they'd lost. There wasn't vocabulary for that kind of grief, not when you knew you might join them tomorrow. The 3rd Armored Division ground forward through this green hell, yard by blood-soaked yard. Engineers developed modifications on the fly, welding steel teeth to the front of Sherman so they could tear through the hedgerows instead of climbing over them. It helped. But it didn't change the fundamental calculus. Every time they pushed through a gap, someone had to go first. Someone had to take the chance that a German gun wasn't waiting on the other side. Lucky's tank, nicknamed Iowa Pride by its original crew, most of whom were dead now, took point more often than felt fair. The commander, Lieutenant Morrison, had a reputation for being lucky himself, threading his tank through ambushes that should have been fatal. The crew joked darkly that they were either blessed or being saved for something worse. The morning of June 17 dawned grey and humid, the kind of weather that made the inside of the tank feel like a steam bath before they'd even started the engine. They'd received orders to probe forward, to find the German lines and, if possible, or punch through. Intelligence suggested light resistance. Intelligence was wrong. By midday, they'd come under fire from concealed positions 3 separate times. They'd knocked out a Panzer IV with a flanking shot, but lost their accompanying infantry to mortar fire. Now they were alone, pushing toward a crossroads marked on the map, moving through terrain that seemed designed specifically to kill tankers. Lucky's hands hadn't stopped shaking since breakfast. He didn't know it yet, but in less than an hour, those shaking hands would save all their lives. The hedgerow loomed like a fortress wall, shadow-dark and impenetrable. Morrison brought the Sherman to a halt, the engine dropping to an idle that did nothing to mask the crew's ragged breathing. On the other side of that ancient barrier, something metallic clanked, track links, maybe, or a turret traversing. The Germans were there, close enough to smell. Morrison's voice crackled through the intercom, steady despite the spike in everyone's pulse. Traverse right. Slow. Gunner, watch for movement. The turret swung with a mechanical whine that sounded like a scream in the silence. Lucky positioned himself beside the ready rack, hand hovering over the armor-piercing shells. Against a Panther, and that deep engine note could only be a Panther, they'd need AP. The high-explosive rounds were useless against that armor, meant for infantry or soft targets. The Sherman lurched forward on Morrison's command, nosing toward a gap in the hedgerow. The driver was threading them through blind, relying on the commander's directions. 10 feet. 5. The gun barrel pushed through the overgrowth. That's when the Panther revealed itself, less than 80 yards away, its long 75mm gun already swinging toward them. The German gunner had been waiting for exactly this moment. Target. Front. The gunner's shout punched through the intercom. Lucky spun toward the ready rack, grabbed what felt like an AP shell in the dim light, swung it toward the breach. The tank hit a rut. His boot, God, that damned clumsy boot, caught on a spent casing that hadn't been secured. He was falling, trying to catch himself, and the shell was wrong. It was he, not AP. He could feel the different weight too late. The breach was open. The gun was on target. There was no time. He jammed the shell home backwards, the driving band catching wrong, his weight forcing it into place with a grinding crunch that shouldn't have worked. The breech slammed shut on instinct, mechanical and unforgiving. The Panther's muzzle flashed white. Morrison screamed fire, and the gunner, not knowing, not having time to know, squeezed the trigger. The Sherman's gun roared. The whole tank rocked backward from the recoil. Time compressed into a single eternal second, the German shell screaming toward them, their own projectile tumbling through the air wrong, impossible, a physics equation written by a madman. The round hit the stone wall of a collapsed farmhouse they hadn't even seen, ricocheted at an angle that defied calculation, and struck the Panther precisely where its thinner side armor met the turret ring. The German tank's ammunition cooked off with a thunderclap that shook the ground. The Panther's turret lifted 3 feet straight up before crashing back down, smoke and flame erupting from every hatch. The German shell meant for Iowa pride buried itself in the hedgerow 2 feet to their left, exploding harmlessly in a shower of dirt and shredded vegetation. Nobody inside the Sherman moved. Nobody breathed. They were still alive, and none of them understood why. The silence after combat is its own kind of violence. The ringing in your ears, the ghost echo of the gun's roar, the sudden awareness of your own heartbeat hammering against your ribs, it all rushes in at once when the shooting stops. Morrison was the first to speak, his voice cracked and distant through the intercom. Report. Everyone report. The responses came back one by one, shaky but alive. Driver, bow gunner, loader. All accounted for. All impossibly, inexplicably intact. Outside, the Panther burned with the peculiar intensity of a tank fire, ammunition cooking off in sporadic bursts, the hull glowing cherry red in places where the armor was thinnest. German crew members were bailing out, their uniforms smoking, stumbling away from the inferno that had been their fortress seconds ago. Lucky stared at his hands. They were still gripping the loading lever, knuckles white. He could feel the wrongness of what had happened, the shell jamming backwards, the breech closing on a round that shouldn't have fired. Every principle of gunnery he'd learned said that shots should have exploded in the barrel, should have turned their turret into a fragmentation grenade with them inside it. The gunner, Corporal Davies, rotated in his seat and looked at Lucky with eyes that had seen something beyond the limits of reason. "What the hell did you load?" Lucky's mouth was dry. I don't know. I grabbed the wrong, I fell, it went in backwards." Morrison's voice cut through the rising panic. "Belay that. I don't care if you loaded a can of beans. That shot saved us." He paused, and they could hear him trying to make sense of it himself. "Someone up there likes us. Or hates the Krauts more." They sat there in the diesel-stinking darkness of the turret, listening to the Panther burn. Survivor's guilt and survivor's euphoria mixing into something they had no words for. They should be dead. The mathematics of tank combat said they should be burning just like the Germans. But they weren't. Morrison radioed their position and the kill, his voice professionally flat for the battalion commander. When he switched off the radio, he said quietly, more to himself than the crew, "Nobody talks about how the shot went in. Understood? Far as anyone knows, it was a clean hit." For voices murmured acknowledgement. Some miracles, they understood, were better left unexplained. But Lucky knew. And he'd spend the rest of his life trying to understand what his clumsiness had created. Stories in war spread like fire through dry grass. By evening, other tank crews were hearing about the impossible shot, the Sherman that killed a Panther at close range, threading through a gap no one could have aimed for. By morning, the details had shifted. Some said it was a lucky ricochet. Others claimed Morrison was the best tank commander in the division, that he'd calculated the shot off the farmhouse wall on purpose. Nobody mentioned the loader who'd jammed a shell in backwards. The battalion intelligence officer came by to examine Iowa Pride's gun. He measured the barrel wear, checked the breech mechanism, asked technical questions that Morrison deflected with military precision. The official report would list it as a deflection shot resulting from superior tactical positioning and crew coordination. The chaos, the terror, the accident that should have killed them all, none of that fit the narrative the army needed. Lucky received a commendation for exemplary performance under fire. He accepted it with a numbness that his commander mistook for humility. The rest of the crew received the same, a paragraph of typed text that transformed their survival into heroism, their luck into skill. The story kept growing. Other units adopted it, modified it, made it their own. A Sherman crew in the 2nd Armored swore they'd heard it was a 1,000-yard shot. A gunner claimed he'd been trained on the technique, using environmental ricochets for armor penetration, though no such training existed. Veterans who'd never been within 50 miles of that hedgerow would later tell their grandchildren they'd been there. Because that's what war does to truth. It sands down the jagged edges of chaos, polishes random survival into purposeful victory. The uncomfortable reality that you're alive because of blind chance, that skill and training and courage might matter less than the angle of a stone wall, doesn't make for good morale. Doesn't make for stories that help you sleep. Lucky started writing different letters home. He told his parents about the commendation, about how his crew was building a reputation. He didn't mention waking up at 0300 replaying the moment over and over, wondering what cosmic dice had rolled in his favor. Didn't mention the 2 new replacement crews they'd received in the weeks that followed, fresh-faced kids who looked at Iowa Pride's kill markings, 5 now, painted on the barrel, with reverent awe. He'd become part of a myth he didn't believe in, celebrated for a miracle that felt more like a curse. Because every time they rolled into combat after that, every time his hands shook while loading a shell, he wondered if the universe's sense of irony had a limit. If the luck he'd never asked for would eventually run out in a way that balanced the scales. The bocage kept claiming tanks. The war kept grinding forward. And the story of the impossible shot kept growing, outliving the men who knew what really happened. VE Day came with champagne and tears, a chaotic celebration that felt both earned and hollow. Lucky stood apart from the revelry, drinking slowly, watching his crewmates embrace and laugh with the kind of relief that only comes when death finally looks away. Morrison had taken shrapnel from a mine 2 weeks before Germany's surrender. He'd survived, but the war was over for him, limping toward a transport ship and a hospital back home. Davies rotated out shortly after, whole in body but carrying something broken behind his eyes. The driver bought it 3 days before the armistice, his Sherman hitting a buried mine that the sweep teams had missed. One moment there, next moment gone. Of the 5 men who'd been in Iowa Pride that June afternoon, only 2 made it home intact enough to walk without help. The years passed with the strange velocity of peacetime. Lucky returned to Iowa, to the farm that suddenly seemed impossibly small and safe. He married a local girl who'd waited for him, raised 3 children who never quite understood why their father would sometimes stop mid-sentence, staring at nothing, his hands trembling like leaves in wind. He didn't talk about the war much. Most veterans didn't. But in 1967, a historian researching tank actions in Normandy tracked him down, wanted to interview him about the famous ricochet shot. Lucky agreed, mostly because saying no felt like dishing the men who hadn't made it back. They met in a diner. The historian had maps, photographs, diagrams of the engagement. He'd calculated angles, consulted ballistics experts, even found a combat report mentioning the Panther kill. The precision, he said, eyes bright with academic excitement, was extraordinary. The commander must have been a genius. Lucky stirred his coffee, watching the cream swirl in patterns that meant nothing. Finally, he said, it was an accident. The historian blinked. I'm sorry. I loaded the wrong shell. Put it in backwards. Tank hit a bump and I lost my footing. Wasn't supposed to fire at all, much less hit anything. Lucky looked up, met the younger man's confused gaze. Morrison was a good commander. Davies was a good gunner. But that shot? That was chaos. Pure dumb luck. The historian's pen had stopped moving. After a moment, he smiled in the uncomfortable way people do when they think you're joking. Well, that's certainly a humble way to look at it. The interview ended shortly after. The book, when it was published, called the shot a masterwork of tactical improvisation and crew synergy. Lucky's name appeared in a footnote, one of many loaders who'd served with distinction. He never corrected the record again. The truth, he'd learned, was negotiable. Memory was the only thing that remained stubborn and exact. Somewhere in Normandy, where hedgerows still divide green fields untouched by the machinery of modern agriculture, there's a crossroads that looks like 1,000 others. The farmhouse is long rebuilt. The fields have been plowed and planted 75 times since soil last tasted blood. If you didn't know what happened there, you'd drive past without a second thought. Lucky returned once, in 1992, part of a veterans tour commemorating D-Day's anniversary. He was 71 years old, moving slowly, his wife steadying him over the uneven ground. They'd lost their way twice before finding the spot. Memory was less reliable than maps, and 50 years had rewritten the landscape. He stood there for a long time, hands in his pockets, looking at nothing in particular. His wife asked if he was all right. He nodded, not trusting his voice. This place had broken him and saved him in the same instant. Had transformed a clumsy farm boy into someone who carried the weight of impossible survival. Every joy in his life, his marriage, his children, the quiet dignity of growing old, existed only because a shell had tumbled wrong and physics had briefly decided to work backwards. The historians still debate whether the story is even possible. Ballistics experts have written papers arguing both sides, that the ricochet angle couldn't have worked, that under specific conditions it absolutely could have. The military archived the combat reports, a bureaucratic eulogy for men who lived and died in seconds too brief for proper documentation. But the story persists because it speaks to something deeper than facts. It captures the fundamental truth of war, that survival is random, that chaos governs more than strategy, that sometimes, just sometimes, the universe's malicious indifference tips in your favor for reasons you'll spend a lifetime trying to understand. Lucky died in 2003, surrounded by family, his last words a mumbled apology to crewmates 60 years gone. The Sherman tank, restored and museum perfect, sits in a depot in Kentucky. Visitors walk past it admiring the armor, the gun, the painted kill marks. A placard mentions the 3rd Armored Division, lists statistics about production numbers and combat effectiveness. It doesn't mention the loader who fumbled, the shell that flew wrong, the miracle that happened when someone tripped. But on quiet mornings, in the space between memory and history, you can almost hear the metallic click of a shell casing hitting the turret floor, and the 5 men breathing in the darkness, impossibly, gratefully alive.